Hello everyone, and it's lovely to be able to meet in this space while we're forced apart. So I've chosen this novel, The Spinning Heart by Donal Ryan for our discussion because although it was written in 2012 in the aftermath of the recession, I think it really captures that awful stillness we're feeling now as everything closes down around us. But hopefully it gives us a sense that this too will pass. So I'm going to share the slides with you now, okay? And if you have any questions, then I'd be delighted to take them at the end. Okay. So things we're going to touch on, and I better move fast. We're going to talk a little about Donal Ryan and the spinning heart and polyphonic narrative, which just refers to the simultaneous voices that we encounter in the narrative. We'll touch on the Irish Psyche, the Recession, Freud, ghost estates and melancholic literature, and the impact of recession on male identity, family relationships, and society. So a little bit about Donal Ryan then. Born in Tipperary in '76, he worked for many years in the civil service before becoming a full-time writer in the University of Limerick. And we were lucky enough to have him speak last year in WIT as part of our English Day event. And he talked a lot about the spinning heart and about his time in the civil service and all the insights it gave into Irish life. So the spinning heart is what we're going to focus on, and of course we know he's had a number of critically acclaimed novels since then, most recently Strange Flowers, which was shortlisted for the An Post Irish Book Awards in 2020. So the spinning heart then is an amalgamation of 21 monologues delivered by the inhabitants of an unnamed small town in Ireland. And of course, because it's an unnamed small town, it could be any town across Ireland, couldn't it? And it focuses on the victims of the country's financial collapse. And Jordan remarks upon the way Ryan reaches back to the archetypes of Irish literature: the terrible father, of course, Frank Mann, the wanton country girl, Lily, the peat black comedy of Flann O'Brien, and dramatic rhythms of Yeats and Synge. So Donal Ryan talks about his work as a labour inspector contributing to the panoply of voices in the spinning heart. And he says, then I was really close to the beating heart. So the many voices of the novel offer a way of experiencing and interacting with the world. And they're also a stand against the authority of a single voice, which we often encounter in a novel, that omniscient, all-knowing narrator. Instead, we have these different voices, each offering us a different perspective. And in Ryan's novel, each perspective bears a certain amount of weight and validity, echoing Bakhtín's assertion that each person's experience is unique and irreplaceable. So a key element then of the polyphonic novel is enabling characters and types to develop into personalities by granting them freedom from others' perspectives and their environment. In The Spinning Heart, Ryan rescues Bobby Mahan's father, Frank, from becoming the stereotype villain, of course, we imagine earlier on in the novel, by granting him an independent voice, even if it is after his demise. And Ryan's personalities speak their truth and contradict each other's narratives to reflect the fractured state of rural Ireland after the recession. So polyphony then is a feature of narrative which includes this diversity of voices that we find in The Spinning Heart and the differing perspectives that come with that. And the effect is a multi-layered narrative in which contradictory voices emerge to create a polyphonic whole. Bakhtin defines polyphony as the plurality of independent and unmerged voices, and praises the style due to its portrayal of an objective world in which characters share equal consciousness. So Donal Ryan creates such a world in The Spinning Heart while gathering those independent and unmerged voices and subjective perspectives under the umbrella of the collective trauma of a recession. So moving on to the Irish Psyche, and I really love this quote by Freud. I don't know whether we should feel pride or shame, but I said, the Irish is one race of people for whom psychoanalysis is of no use whatsoever. And maybe we get an insight into that in the novel, particularly with the narratives of Shawnee and Timmy and so on, you know, so unaware really in many ways of what's going on for them. So Donal Ryan's novel and short stories then delve deep into the Irish psyche, the marginal voices of rural Ireland, which we rarely hear, the intensity of small town divides, and the weight of the recession on family life. Many of the stories traverse familiar ground, so we encounter nationalism, emigration, postcolonialism, and Catholicism, all these aspects of Irish culture that shape our identity. And, we know that storytelling has long been used in Ireland, both to tell stories and to heal and repair, drawing on our great sean-nós tradition. And writers like Donal Ryan serve as a valuable roadmap to the paradox pocket landscape of the national psyche, a psyche simultaneously bound to joy and melancholia. So perhaps that's what Freud meant by Psychoanalysis. So moving on to the recession then, and in September 2008, the Irish government officially acknowledged the country's descent into recession. The crisis stemmed from the collapse of the domestic property sector and subsequent contraction in national output. Approximately 8.7 million jobs were lost from February 2008 to February 2010, and real GDP contracted by 4.2%, making the Great Recession the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. So Buchanan 2009 refers to the period preceding the economic collapse as an escape from Irish history, with Lewis further noting that the swiftness of the move from poverty to wealth in Ireland during that time was without precedent in economic history. So the economic boom then was largely based on heavily inflated house prices and frantic overborrowing as a result. And we really get an insight into this in Recession's narrative. And, she talks about buying the house. And when Daddy and me went into the auctioneers to ask about these houses, they let on they were nearly all sold. And I believed them, and Daddy got all worried and flustered then and drove like a madman back to the credit union to get me the cash. So we get an insight into the way in which the Celtic Tiger just overtook people. And, when the economy collapsed, it left thousands of people in unmanageable debt and tied to houses that they could no longer afford, or at best in negative equity, paying for a house that was worth a fraction of what they borrowed. And Fintan O'Toole observes that Irish prices had fallen more rapidly than any others in Europe. The average Irish family had lost almost half of its financial assets, whose worth had fallen from 95,000 at the height of the boom to 51,000 in mid-2009, not counting the steep decline in the worth of its house. So a key aspect of this, of course, is the ghost estate, and we see this in Recession's narrative. There's just her and an old woman among the 40-odd houses in this estate. So the novel employs the symbolism of the recession area and the ghost estates that pervaded the Irish landscape in the aftermath of the recession, when one home in every 5 was an empty shell. And of course, these unoccupied housing estates are still scattered ominously throughout the landscape, aren't they? And I'm in the Midlands now, and there's quite a few of them around Longford, Leitrim, Cavan and Roscommon, which were the worst hit counties following the recession. So the ghost estates then serve as a metaphor for the economic collapse of 2008 and the loss of an imagined or perceived future of prosperity. So they've become powerful signifiers then of melancholia or sadness in the post-recession Irish landscape. The ghost estates, one of Donal Ryan's sites of trauma in the spinning heart, serve as a concrete testimony to the follies of the Celtic Tiger. Empty houses became ruins, even as people were being made homeless or being let down by the social care and health systems. So the ghost estates, according to Mulrennan then, are monuments to the people we thought we were, a post-religious state with a foot in the door of the global markets. So a place where, I suppose, Catholicism has been replaced by the new master of capitalism and everything that goes with that. So as the Irish landscape is ever shifting, what people discover is that the sense of power that people felt during the Celtic Tiger years was imagined, and that real power lay elsewhere. The spinning heart acknowledges the nation's compliance in creating the economic collapse, but tells us that the real damage has been done elsewhere by the people holding the power. And that's what we're confronted with in the text, isn't it? So many powerless characters in the aftermath of the recession. So if the Celtic Tiger had lastingly altered the landscape, boosting urbanisation and estate building, the economic meltdown has left lasting scars on the Irish landscape. The myth of an unspoiled rural land has crumbled, thereby challenging the Irish ethnoscape and questioning the relevance of Irishness. And by ethnoscape there, we're really referring to the landscape of people who we find in the world in which we live. So it includes the Irish, but the Irish diaspora, which are mentioned throughout the novel, and also the immigrants that held up the Celtic Tiger as well, like the C2 workers like Basia in the novel too. Okay, and by focusing on rampant urbanisation, renewed immigration or ghost estates, writers like Donal Ryan deconstruct the deep-rooted connection between national identity and the land. And Pokey Burke's father, Josie, admits in hindsight, we should have known it would all end in tears. Around here, it all started with tears. So the division of the land, like our Lord's purple robe, that's removing the Cunliffe family name, serves as a curse on the village, sending many people's hearts spinning and their worlds toppling. So moving on to melancholic literature then, and in his essay Mourning and Melancholia, Sigmund Freud distinguished melancholia from what he considers to be the healthier state of mourning, that is, the suffering engendered by the loss of a loved one. In melancholia, Freud argued the sufferer is experiencing the perceived loss of a part of the self. So it's an ego injury, a narcissistic injury that results in heightened self-criticism, self-reproach, guilt and remorse, as well as withdrawal from the world around them and an inability to find comfort or pleasure in that world. Freud outlines the distinguishing features of melancholia as a profoundly painful dejection, cessation of interest in all the outside world, loss of the capacity to love, inhibition of all activity, and a lowering of the self-regarding feelings to a degree that finds utterances in self-reproaches and self-revilings and culminates in a delusional expectation of punishment. And this perhaps gives us some insights into Bobby's psyche, his feelings of worthlessness, and also his, feelings when encountered with Frank's dead body at the end of the novel. The idea of this expectation of punishment maybe helps us understand a little more why he doesn't realise his own innocence. So Slavin asserts that Irish Recession literature can best be interpreted through the lens of melancholia, which is understood as an unarticulated and unconscious grief at the loss of what was perceived to be, in the height of the Celtic Tiger, a glorious neoliberal future. In The Spinning Heart, all the characters are trying to come to terms with the sudden economic downfall, and most are despairing and melancholic. So the novel is a continuous reflection upon the family unit and how the breakdown of society can be tied to the breakdown of the family. Okay, so it offers a testimony of the collapse of normality in people's everyday life, especially within the family unit. And we see this in the ways that the different families in the narrative negotiate change, and their ability to react to situational change is largely dependent on their level of adaptability and their level of cohesion as a family unit. So consider the following excerpt from Freud's essay, in particular relation to Bobby Mahan, the character. So the essential thing is not whether the melancholic self-denigration is correct, in the sense that self-criticism agrees with the opinion of other people. The point must rather be that he's giving a correct description of his psychological association. He has lost his self-respect, a loss in regard to his ego. So we know from the many narratives we encounter in The Spinning Heart that Bobby's very well thought of, isn't he? Bobby's the person that people trust to get things done and so on. So this doesn't correlate with Bobby's perception of himself in the novel, and that's really what Freud is telling us here. So thinking about Bobby, and of course going back to Bobby's narrative, he tells us, I had a right swagger there for a couple of years, thinking I was a great fella. I was clearing £1,000 a week, set for life. Houses would never stop going up. I'd see babies like our own being pushed around the village below and think, lovely, work for the future. They'll all need their own houses someday too. Imagine being so suddenly useless. Okay, so there we get an insight into the effect that the recession had, not just on society, but specifically on male identity, particularly in a patriarchal society where many men still view themselves as the breadwinner, and the impact that the loss of that role has on their ego as a result. And Bobby says, I laughed then through my invisible tears. So Irish male identity is particularly affected as the monologues of the male characters reveal a mostly internalized response to external disaster. The 2008 recession was termed a male recession because it was male-dominated occupations such as construction and manufacturing that were most badly affected. And there are several isolated males in the text, and young male characters such as Brian, Rory, and Shawnee Shaper, who are all disconnected in some way from society or from themselves. And of course, we see all the banter in their narratives and all the, the showing off and so, which really reveals to us a fragile ego, doesn't it? And even Bobby, though he has the support of Trina and so on, Trina talks in her narrative about how difficult it is to get him to talk about how he's feeling and so on. And those rare moments, when he enters in an uninterrupted stream of consciousness, and she's almost afraid to talk for fear of disrupting this moment. So for young men who subscribe to hegemonic ideals, there's a potential loss of identity and emasculation as a result of the recession, thus making them more susceptible to negative mental health. And of course, if we look at the coping mechanisms employed by the young men in the novel, it's mainly escape, isn't it? Either through alcohol or through another perceived possibility, whether that's going to London or going to Australia, but there never is a true connection with their self and their feelings and so on. Okay. So another key aspect of the novel, and really integral to understanding the narrative, is the father and son relationships. And the novel conveys the complexity of Irish masculine norms in different contexts, but also the complexity of the relationship between father and son. Most of the filial relationships in the novel are profoundly dysfunctional, and the impact of this dysfunction is revealed in the character's monologue. So if we think of the cruelty of Frank's treatment of Bobby and his mother, and this to me is one of the moments of profound sadness in the novel, the Bobby and his mother would flee from Frank at times, they always returned. And Ryan reveals the collateral damage of this dynamic as Bobby and his mother silently and tacitly agree to become strangers to each other rather than leave him. And even Trina fails to understand. It's like, why did they stop talking rather? And Bobby says there really was no reason, but it was almost just to keep Frank at bay, wasn't it? And then of course Bobby's mother dies, and the pain that goes with that unresolved trauma. Frank's monologue at the end tells us that he too was cruelly treated by his father, revealing an intergenerational pattern of abuse and neglect. The relationship between Josie and his sons and Dennis and his father are similarly full of conflict and complexity. And Mulrennan refers to the novel as a multi-layered deconstruction of the internal exile of the Irish male identity in post-Celtic Tiger rural Ireland. So thinking about the impact of the recession then on family life, we see this directly transmitted through job and income loss in the novel. And Bobby goes from, a foreman carrying $1,000 a week or 20/50s in his pocket, as he says, to nothing at all. And we also see the gross exploitation there of the C2 workers, the fact that stamps weren't paid for the lads and so on. And of course, this is a slow reckoning, isn't it, as they queue in the social welfare office and realise what has happened. And job loss ranks in the upper quartile of stress when compared with other major life changes, and often leads to detrimental outcomes for families. A significant outcome of unemployment is the deterioration of the psychological well-being, not only of the unemployed parent, but also of other family members experiencing the stressful adjustment to a lower standard of living and to uncertainty about what the future will hold. Evidence also suggests that the unemployment of one spouse is associated with a reduction in the well-being of the other spouse. Therefore, families with strong coping mechanisms, with high adaptability and cohesion, tend to fare better during recession periods. So when we come to Dennis's narrative, he says, "I haven't a snowball's chance in hell of a job. I'm owed a small fortune. The sky is falling down." So it's quite apocalyptic, isn't it? And it's an example of Callaghan's observation about many of the town's people. These people have been left in a rut, spinning their wheels as well as their hearts. Depression has caused them to lose their former sense of themselves. So in The Spinning Heart, Ryan captures the collective trauma of individuals, their family, and their fractured society as a result of the economic crash. The shifting landscape of people offers a microcosm of Irish society. The isolation of the village emphasises the powerlessness of the community. The decision makers, the politicians, and the bankers are elsewhere. And as O'Toole observes, Ireland is a diaspora, and as such is both a real place and a remembered place. Ireland is often something that happens elsewhere. So the multiple perspectives are rooted in the national identity crisis in 21st century Ireland and reveal to the reader the complex and traumatised Irish ethnoscape. Thank you.